Okay, so let me just share my screen. Thank you for bearing with me. We're just going to be focusing on some React fundamentals, starting with how React actually renders content to the page to React DOM. So let's try to understand what React DOM is. So let's try. The fundamentals that we'll be covering is just React DOM, and we'll be looking at starting with how React renders your app into the browser through React DOM and create route, then moving into components and JSX and some common debugging strategies. So let's start with what understanding what React DOM is. So one of the things that you should always understand is how React renders your app into the browser using React DOM and create route. Because so the React DOM it helps us understand how a React app actually gets mounted in the browser, and then because React DOM is the to one way to understand React DOM is like it's the web specific layer of React. It's what lets React communicate with the browser's DOM. Now, the DOM here refers to document object model, and it loads your app into the page. So when the browser loads index.html, React tends to target the div ID that typically has the ID root, then create root, connects React to that root element, and then the line tells React what component tree to place there, usually starting with this app tag. So, if I had to summarize it in some shorter words, so React DOM is basically the bridge between React and the browser. So, create root finds the root div, and render mounts your React app inside it. So, some of the responsibilities that is involved when it comes to DOM is that it always manages communication with the browser's DOM, and then it also manages HTML attributes and properties, and it also sets up listeners for some browser level events. So now let's move forward into understanding what a component is. So a component is basically are like the building blocks of your user interface. They let you break into a page into smaller reusable pieces, which make your code easier to read, manage, and scale. So, for example, instead of writing a huge file for one huge file for an entire page, you might create separate components for an nav bar, for a profile card, button, or footer. And here are some of the common syntax. Once you start building UIs this way, React becomes much easier to organize because you're composing small pieces there together instead of managing everything at once. So here are some common syntax for writing components. In most cases, a React component is written as a JavaScript that returns JSX. So for and here are some naming conventions when it comes to components. For it to work properly, its name should start with a capital letter, and it should always return a single structure to render. And and yes, here There are a couple of also there are like some conventions to keep in mind. So first, and it should always return. So that doesn't mean only one element will remain on the page. It just means that everything needs to be wrapped up inside one parent, or a React fragment. And here are some syntax styles to which those components are declared. So here are some component rules to ensure that your components remain consistent, predictable, and maintainable across the code base. So as I mentioned before, components must start with a capital letter. They should always be given the same inputs, that is in this case properties, and then there should be no side effects when it comes to rendering any components. So that does mean that the logic inside those components must not change any objects or variables that existed before the page is being rendered. And then you should never like mutate any change any properties or state directly. We should always treat them as read only. And the best practices to follow, try to use Pascal case for component names and their file names. And there should be only one component per file so that your components stay organized and they are like easily searchable. And once the component has been defined, please be sure to utilize export default for the main component to simplify importing. And as always, try to keep your components small and focused on a single responsibility. So there, but Okay, so as per React provides like several built-in components with uh, with specific dev-only functions, while the tree defines the application's structure. So some built-in components in React include the React.fragment. This component helps group multiple elements without adding extra nodes to the DOM, thereby keeping the HTML clean. And there's also React.strict code. It is to think You should think of it as a tool for highlighting potential problems. It intentionally double invokes render functions in dev mode. So one key advice to that is that do not remove it if you see. And here is one example of how the components nest to form the UI. And this is how the this is the component tree of a shopping cart app, where is where you can see the data flows down from the trees via props, which is properties. And here, and just take a look at this example. Does anybody have any questions so far? I just wanted to take this moment to, really pause and see if everybody's with me so far. You can even put your questions in the chat if you're shy of, speaking.
Can you explain more React.fragment?
Can I explain more on React? Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So more about React fragment is that it is useful when you want a component to return multiple elements side by side without wrapping them in an extra div. So in React, a component only has to return a single parent structure. Sometimes there are instances where you don't actually want an extra HTML element in the page just to satisfy that rule. So that is where React fragment helps. It helps you group elements together logically for React without creating an extra node in the DOM. So, for example, if I want to return a header and a paragraph together, I could wrap them in a fragment instead of a div. So that helps us keep a much cleaner page. You will often see it written as either React.fragment or with just the tags that you can see right over here. I hope that makes things more clear.
Okay, yeah, I think I did understand a little bit. Like it's so instead of making a component,
Mhm.
combining them and making as a component, you could also write it like a fragment. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yes and no. So, a fragment is not a replacement for creating a component. It is just a wrapper that lets one component return multiple elements without adding an extra HTML element to this page. A component is just a reusable piece of UI with its own logic and structure, whereas a fragment is just a grouping tool that is used inside a component's return. So, uh, let's so to if I were to sum this up, if I already have a component and if I want to return a header and a paragraph together, I can just wrap those in a fragment, and that way I'm still inside the same component, and I'm just avoiding adding an unnecessary div. Because if you have if you have if you have worked with developing pages, if you will be working with developing pages later in this cohort, and you will see how much trouble that an extra div just gives up. So try to think of it of a component as a UI unit and a fragment as a wrapper used within that unit. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So anytime. And also, if any of you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or just feel free to interrupt me anytime. Okay, I will not mind. So, as I mentioned before, these components have let's talk. These components return JSX. So let's understand what JSX is, because it is usually what is returned by these components. So JSX is nothing but a syntax extension for JavaScript that lets you write HTML like UI inside your code, which is later compiled by tools like Vite or Bubble into standard React create element calls. So this is one example of what the if you write this kind of code in JSX, so this is what White compiles them into. So I hope that does uh, that does make enough sense. So tools like White compile it into React or create element calls before the browser ever sees it. And then the main reason we use JSX is readability. And then as you go on to create more complex UIs, you will realize that writing nested React or create elements will calls by hand can get a bit hard to read very quickly, whereas JSX lets you visualize the UI structure at a glance. So if this is what JSX is, the next thing that we kind of have to understand is the rules that the JSX follows, because in terms of strictness, JSX is slightly stricter than plain HTML. So here are some uh, here are some essential guidelines for writing clean and valid JSX in React applications. So every tag must, of course, be closed. Even self-closing ones like the image tag or the input tag, you always have to return a single, you also need to return a single parent element, and some HTML attribute names change in JSX, like class becomes class name and for becomes HTML4. So JSX, while JSX might look familiar, React, JSX looks a bit familiar, but it React applies like JavaScript friendly rules to it. So one of the most useful parts of JSX is that you can uh, mix JavaScript directly into your markup by using curly braces. So that lets you display variables, evaluate expressions, and render dynamic content right inside the user interface. And then you can also apply CSS properties to your elements. So, for example, you can pass dynamic values into source or alt or class name or other properties using curly braces as well. So once JSX can display dynamic values, the next step is controlling what shows up, and that brings us to conditional rendering. So what is the process of conditional rendering? It is a so it's just the idea that React can show different UI user interfaces depending on certain conditions. So, for example, if you might use an if statement or the logical and operator to decide what should appear on the screen. So this is part of this is useful when you want to show something only if that data exists, or only if the user is logged in, or only if the certain flag is true. And then and then one of the common patterns in React is using logical AND when you want to render something only when a condition is true. Or you could even use ternary operators like the one you see in example in this particular example right here, where we just check if the user is logged in. If it's logged in, we get a paragraph element that says welcome back, or else we just put in the login button. So that is one of the conditions that you would definitely see when you try to, that is part of what conditional rendering is. And then so that is the core idea behind conditional rendering. And then if you want to render lists, and then there's also another pattern in React that's called list rendering, where instead of writing repeated UI by hand, you can generate it from an array of data. So one of those methods that you can use is the map method, and then unique and then you take a data array of data and then transform each of them into a piece of JSX elements. And one point to note, that when rendering lists in React, each item should also have a unique key prop so that React can track changes efficiently when items are added, removed, or reordered. And uh, so the general pattern would be start with an array, use the map method to return JSX, and make sure that each rendered item has a stable unique key and a good and the key and a good now when I say key, it should be something like an ID from your data, not the array index unless there is no better option. Is everybody with me so far? Any questions so far? Okay, so I'm gonna take that response as no for now. But for those of you who have joined in a little late, I would recommend putting your name in the chat just so I know that everybody's here. I know it's a little late to say, but still better late than never, right? So here are some common methods to read error messages. There will be times where we will be making errors and there's no escaping it. So while we compile our React apps using Vite, there will be an error overlay in your browser, which can be like a helpful tool for debugging. And uh, if you learn how to take a closer look at it, I think that will help you solve a lot of problems when it comes to troubleshooting or debugging process. So here are some steps on how to identify or read the error. So you should probably read the large text at the top first, so that would indicate what kind of error is it, and then try to locate the source of the error. So you may want to look for a caret. It looks like something like an upwards arrow. It points to the exact line number and character that's causing the issue. And you can always ignore the stack trace. Now, the stack trace is like the long list of function calls that is made right below the error, unless the main message is unclear. And then when you run React apps, the same error message will also appear in your terminal for reference. So some common errors include like missing fragments. Like I said, there are some times when JSX elements are must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Sometimes even I forget to do that. So a good practice would be if you're using some opening tags, try to use closing tags as well. And then another key error is that each child in a list should have a unique key property. So if you're trying to, one of the, and then there are times where elements might not have those keys. So a common way to fix that would be to add key in a map. And let's see what else is there. Yep. So, one good extension that I've really come across is that it's called React Developer Tools. I think that it is one of the must-have browser extension for debugging React applications. Uh, it Some of the features for that it does for you, it's like it helps inspect the component tree. It gives you like a live structure of components which mirrors the DOM inspector's functionality. It also allows you to view and edit props or states. It provides real access time to modify props and state for instant testing if you ever wish to do so. And then you can always record and analyze render times to identify and resolve bottlenecks when it comes to performance. And then you can always it also helps you trace screen elements directly to their source components to help speed up bugging. So it is available on Chrome and Firefox. It is also available on Safari and Edge as a standalone app. And I believe that if you look at the course materials, I think there are instructions on how to enable React Developer Tools as an extension in your browser. Okay, so just to sum up what we have discussed so far, React DOM is a bridge for React to the browser DOM, which is via create root, and then components are pure JavaScript functions that return JSX and form a UI tree. And JSX is kind of like an HTML-like syntax that compiles to React.create element calls. And then finally, for troubleshooting, always make sure to employ a top-down approach while reading errors and try to use the Vite or overlay plus DevTools to speed up that process. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Yes, sir. Can I ask a question? Is it if I would like to have a couple of extensions connected with React per one browser, will they have any conflicts between each other?
It kind of depends upon what extensions that you are trying to enable. Usually the extensions that I have had so far work independently and do not cause trouble like that. I haven't come across any other situation where two different extensions have like conflicting tasks, if you know what I mean. So I
Yeah.
don't see it I don't see it as a possibility, but in case it does, it is very likely that those that you may have downloaded like two extensions for the same purpose. So it is very important to always take a closer look at what those extensions do for you. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, so now next we are just going to be taking at some code that I've actually done. So that I've done. So let me just take a moment and try to share my screen again. Okay, so it's recording now. Okay, just give me a minute here. Okay. So, without any further ado, just uh, this is one of the this is the coding example that I've come up with. So we'll just start at every entry point of this uh, of every React app ever. So this is like main.jsx where the this create root line mounts the app inside the router. So as we go, you will notice that every single app is built from components, and how JSX is returned from those components, and how we can conditionally render them with patterns like and how lists are rendered with the map method and a unique key. So, and if we hit an error, that's actually useful because the Vite overlay would be able to tell us the main issue right at the top, and React DevTools is also there to inspect the component tree, prop, and states while we debug. So, let's go forward to the app.jsx. So, this is the simple function where this is the main component that organizes the rest of the UI. This component acts like the top level container for this app. It typically imports other smaller components and then arranges them together, which is a good example of component composition in React. And as always, once those functions are defined, please always make it a point to export them as defaults because without this, the main.jsx would just not work. And now, if we take a closer look to our dev card, you can see that there have been so once a component is defined, you will always see that the main component in that file is exported is as the default export. So that makes it easier to import. And now let's take a closer look at the JSX that this returns. And then that is why we have the next card where the developer UI card is being structured. You will notice that instead of putting everything inside a giant block, the UI is broken into smaller parts and composed inside an app. That is one of the best things about React. And then taking a closer look onto dev card is that you can always consider this is the standard card that has been created, and there have been some errors that have deliberately put there just to see if you can identify those. Can you help me identify those errors? Okay, so how about this? Let's try and run this app. Let's see what happens. Okay, see, this is how this is how the white overlay would just help you understand what issues comes up with the errors. So this is how the messages come up, and here is the stack trace. Now the stack trace is not usually important unless there is an error that's not like completely understood. And then you should always try to look at this particular error. And this is some part of the uh, common issues that you can see when you try to that can help us identify errors during debugging. The most important part is always the error message at the top, which is right over here. And then you can that because it tells you what kind of problem the React or the compiler has detected. So the stack trace is usually there when you need more context, but for common JSX issues, you want to focus first on the main page, the file name, the caret pointing to where the parser might get confused. So in examples like this, the problem is often something like a missing closing tag or some invalid JSX tags or multiple sibling elements not wrapped in a single palette. So in this case, the unordered list was completely not closed. So if we close that, you can see that there is always a particular example just to see how these errors can help us fix it. So now let's make sure that our file is saved. Not a big fan of the share screen that you may not see here, but I definitely see it. But yeah, so let's see if our website can be loaded again. So now you can see once the errors are fixed, we it is you can see that the app is like completely rendered, and there are no problems. And one but good example of the conditional rendering that I just said is that if you notice on line 3, I have created a Boolean variable called is available. Now see on line 10, there I had put in a condition. So uh, if the if the this variable is set to false, uh, so if that value is true or false, and then we would decide what kind of it checks whether this value is true or false, and then decides whether to whether that this piece of UI should appear. Now, if I set it to true, maybe this could change. Maybe this could change things. And once I set it to true, that is where this could help bring out something else. So as you can see, before this open to work was not there, but eventually once the element was set to true, and this is one small example of how uh, condition we can always use conditional rendering to show different elements based on different conditions. Okay, so does anybody have any questions so far about the coding example? Like maybe there was something that maybe wasn't like totally understandable, or maybe there was it was just something that was not clear.
I have a question, sir. So I noticed that you have styling in the code, and I just don't know how we will use in the future. Will we also use the styling inside of the code, or the styling of elements we will move to the CSS file mainly?
Okay. So for the purpose, so it kind of depends. That's actually a good question. So in React, like both approaches are possible. You can either put styles directly inside the component using inline styles, just like I had did in my example, or you could just move it into a separate CSS file. For most larger projects, you will usually keep post styling in CSS files because it is cleaner and easier to maintain. Inline styling is often used for small dynamic cases, like when a color, size, or visibility depends on the current state of that element, or it is on props. So in practice, you might use a CSS file for the overall layout and then reusable styling, but you will use inline styles when something needs to change dynamically based on data. So to answer your question, going forward, you will definitely see styling moved inside the CSS files a lot, but React also gives you the flexibility to style directly in code whenever that there are conditions that make sense. I hope that explanation made a lot helped you understand more.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
What about the rest? Do you have any other questions?
I actually have one more question. Can I ask it?
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Ask as many questions as you can.
in one of the group sessions last week, there was the situation that the portal of 5173 was busy by some other activities in the computer. So we just couldn't start our code. Does this situation happen often that this port 5173 is just blocked by some other process on the computer? And
Mhm.
if there is any other chance that we can manually change this port in the other port, if something happens like that?
Well, to answer your question, yes, that can definitely happen. It's not usually a problem, a React problem. So port 5173 is just Vite's default development port. So if another process is already using it, Vite, that is why Vite may fail. And yes, you can always set it up. So let me just share my screen and I'll show you exactly how you can set that. Okay, so is my screen visible?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, so let's say that terminal 5173 is busy with something else. So in the example, instead of you're running just the dev script, you can always specify an option to set a port that may not be busy. Let's say so this is the typical command that you type, like this npm run dev double quotes double quote hyphens double hyphens port, and after the port you specify which port you want to run it on. So let's see if this command works. And then, as you can see, you instead of running on 5173 like it was running before, it is still running on on port 3000. And you can it's not just 3000, you can run it on practically any other port that you can. Let's see if we can run it on some other ports. Can anybody give me just a random 4-digit number? Let's see if that port exists or not. So let's just try maybe 1 2 3 4. Maybe that port exists or maybe it doesn't. But let's try if it works there or not. Yes. So this definitely does happen from time to time, especially if another dev server is running. But it's usually easy to run a fix either by either stopping by the other process, or you can just choose a different run port. What I will do is that I will put this in a different chat. And okay, someone put in 5120. Let's see if that port exists. So if I put a 5120, yes, well, it does work there. And our application is being rendered as usual. So you can just, so apparently you can enter any random numbers that you can. Oh, I just realized that you guys are on just the VS Code. Hold on. Let me just show again real quick. Okay, so as you can see, on post 5120, the application is still being rendered. So this is one of the ways that you could set a random port to run it to. Now, how can I copy this? Just put this command in a chat in case you want to if you ever run into issues like this, you can always use this command to run into some other custom port. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. A very good explanation.
All right. So okay, so let's see. Well, the I just wanted to take this moment and just see if anybody else has any questions. Maybe it could be about maybe it could be just about the course in general, or maybe the assignment in case if you any of you have like started working on it. So yeah, I'll just be taking this time to field any questions now.
Yes. The code that you just have it there, Dev. I forgot. I forgot. We have to create a new file or install or how that gonna work. That what you were explaining. You have a file there or folder.
Are you referring to the folder that I was showing in Visual Studio? Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, yeah. That what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay. So one of the ways that you can create you can always create a random like a React template using this command in your terminal. So all you have to do is just open up your like create a new folder, and inside that folder you can type this command in the terminal itself. So what this does is that it will create a whole React template just like this, just like the one that I have showed you. No, Eddie, unfortunately, I'm not sharing my screen at this moment, and I will get you to your question in a moment. So so I hope that answers your question. And then after that, I had just made some random other changes, Blanca, and for this example, I intend to upload it on GitHub so that every one of you can see how can take a closer look at the code and maybe try to do some more experiments on your own.
All right. Thank you.
And to answer your question, Eddie. Are the exercises in the dashboard a separate activity from the assignments? Hold on, I don't know what you mean. Uh, Hold on. What are the exercises? Hold on. Let me just see if I can find them real quick.
In the week two exercise, in the week two lesson, if you
Mm-hmm.
scroll maybe like, I don't know, like 75% of the way down the page, there's a link to the Code the Dream GitHub that contains like weekly exercises. But then if you scroll down further on the first page, there's the weekly assignment. So I was a little confused if both are required to be completed or if the exercises are meant as like as exercises to help with the assignment.
As far as I know, think uh I think this is the particular hold on, just give me a moment while I actually read it. Uh each lesson is precise. As far as I know, I think this will also be part of the assignment. I'm not entirely sure about it because there's already another. I think you guys are already working on another to-do list. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I think that is something that has to be that has to be like checked in. So I think yeah, you may have to do the weekly exercises and also work on your to-do list if that makes sense.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions?
I have a question, sir. Can you show,
Sure.
please, how to mute correctly the piece of code in React?
Uh,
The
I'm sorry, could you
options
repeat your question again?
to put to put the commentaries correctly and how to mute the part of the code. Let's say we put slash and then like little star and then piece of code, and that is we were muting some part of code. So with the to put the
Oh,
commentaries or
okay.
something. Yeah.
Oh,
And
okay. I think I understand what you mean. I think you want to like comment out some code, like maybe just mute this out. Hold on. So a common shortcut that helps us do this is either you could try to add Means no. Let me see what does this do. So on Visual Studio, if you just put control and forward slash, It will help you mute out any piece of code that you don't want to, and it just doesn't work. It's not just for single line comments. If I want to completely, let's say, get rid of these two, then I can always comment this out. And this is one of the ways that you can comment code. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Sarah, thank you. But that is in JSX files, right? But if we take like a app.css file there, we will comment traditionally how we were doing when we worked with JavaScript, right?
Yes. So in app or dot JSX, the if you want to like comment out any piece of code here, then I believe it would be commented out the same way that we just did in the example above. So if you ever want to comment out any code in JSX, you would always start with the open up with the curly brace and then put a forward slash and then an asterisk, and then be sure to close out, otherwise your entire code will be like it will there will be a lot of issues with rendering. So if you're commenting out code, just make sure that you're doing it really carefully.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay, so let me just go ahead and stop sharing this, stop recording.